I thought I was just spending $52 to save a stranger from humiliation at a Walmart checkout. I had no idea that weeks later, that same woman would sit at the head of a millionaire family table, hiding cold calculations behind a polite smile. I certainly never expected one tiny receipt to drag me into a vicious war of inheritance, forged memos, and a final brutal revenge that left a room full of elites completely dead silent. My name is Eva Evans. I am 34 years old, and I work as a senior fraud analyst at Harbor Ledger Risk Group right here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. If you want to know what it feels like to lose your faith in humanity, one spreadsheet at a time, you should try my job. My days are spent digging through medical payment discrepancies, hunting down phantom billing codes for procedures that never happened, and investigating clinics that exist only on paper. By 5 o'clock on a Friday, my brain usually feels like a wrung-out sponge and my emotional reserves are entirely depleted. Today had been especially brutal. I had spent 8 continuous hours unraveling a massive insurance scam involving vulnerable elderly patients, and the sheer audacity of the theft had left me with a bitter taste in my mouth. I was completely exhausted both mentally and spiritually. All I wanted was to go home, take off my stiff work clothes, and not think about money or liars for the next 48 hours. But my pantry was completely empty and my golden retriever was out of kibble. So on my way back to my apartment, I pulled my sedan into the massive parking lot of a local Walmart. Walking through those sliding glass doors, I felt the familiar assault on my senses. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale glow over everything in sight. The squeak of shopping cart wheels echoed down the wide aisles, mixing with the muffled generic pop music playing from the ceiling speakers. I grabbed a red plastic basket and moved quickly, pulling only the absolute essentials from the shelves. I tossed in a heavy bag of dry dog food, a gallon of 2% milk, a loaf of whole wheat bread, a few cans of chicken noodle soup, and a heavy plastic jug of laundry detergent. It was the shopping list of a woman functioning purely on survival mode. Someone who just wanted to pay her bill and escape back to the quiet sanctuary of her home. I maneuvered my heavy basket toward checkout lane number 6 and let out a long sigh as I waited in line. That was when I truly noticed the person standing directly in front of me. She was an older woman, maybe in her late 70s. She wore a beautifully tailored camel wool coat that draped perfectly over her slender frame. Her silver hair was pulled back and pinned into an immaculate, elegant bun. From the back, she looked like a woman who belonged in a high-end boutique downtown, not standing under the flickering lights of a discount superstore. But her shoulders were slumped with a heavy invisible weight, and despite her polished appearance, she radiated a profound sense of exhaustion. The teenage cashier wearing a rumpled blue vest dragged the woman's items across the glass scanner. A small tin of loose-leaf tea, a box of premium crackers, a jar of strawberry preserves, and a few other modest groceries. The register beeped its final tally. "Your total is $52, the cashier mumbled, barely making eye contact. The older woman opened her leather purse and pulled out a sleek credit card. She handed it over with a quiet dignity. The cashier swiped it. The machine let out a sharp, angry buzz. "It says declined," the teenager announced, popping her chewing gum. The woman did not flinch. She did not act surprised or pat her coat pockets in a theatrical display of searching for another wallet. She simply nodded slowly. "Try it one more time, please," she said. Her voice was incredibly soft, but it carried a strange, authoritative stillness. The cashier swiped the card again. The same angry buzz echoed in the small space. Declined again. This is the moment where most people panic. They get angry at the machine, they blame the bank, or they laugh nervously and offer a convoluted excuse about transferring funds. This woman did none of those things. She did not argue, and she offered zero explanations. She simply reached out with slightly trembling hands and began sliding her items backward along the metal conveyor belt. She looked as though she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole, pulling her away from the harsh white lights and the staring eyes of the strangers in line behind her. My analyst's brain, the part of me trained to spot anomalies and inconsistencies, instantly clicked into gear. Something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. I analyze people and financial behaviors for a living, and this woman simply did not fit the profile of someone who was completely broke. As she reached for the tin of tea, I noticed her hands. She was wearing vintage gloves that were old, but crafted from incredibly fine, buttery leather. When her sleeve rode up just a fraction of an inch, I caught a glimpse of the watch on her left wrist. It was discreet, unflashy, but clearly a high-end piece that cost more than my entire car. And beyond the material things, her demeanor was entirely out of place. Her silence and her unnatural calmness felt like the practiced composure of someone who was intimately familiar with the art of hiding her true emotions behind an impenetrable wall. Then she reached for the box of crackers, and a sudden violent memory slammed into my chest. Suddenly, I was not 34 years old anymore. I was 10 years old, standing in a similar checkout lane in Claremore, Oklahoma, holding my mother's hand. I remembered watching my mother, an exhausted school secretary, silently counting crumpled $1 bills and loose quarters on a black rubber belt, trying to decide if we had enough money to buy both laundry soap and a carton of eggs. I remembered the burning shame in my mother's eyes as she quietly told the cashier she would have to put the eggs back. That memory always carried a specific kind of quiet devastation. I felt a hard lump form in my throat. I could not stand there and watch this proud woman dismantle her dignity piece by piece over a minor grocery bill. Before I even fully processed what I was doing, I stepped forward, closing the gap between us. I reached over her shoulder and firmly inserted my own debit card into the chip reader on the terminal. "Put it all on my card," I told the cashier, my voice sharp and decisive. The cashier blinked, popped her gum once, and hit the button to approve the transaction. The receipt machine immediately began whirring and spitting out the long slip of white paper. I did not do it to be a hero. I did not ask for the woman's name, and I certainly did not want a long, drawn-out display of gratitude. I just wanted to erase the humiliation from the air. I wanted her to take her tea and her dignity and go home in peace. The older woman stopped moving. She turned around slowly and faced me. I braced myself for the tears or the embarrassed apologies that usually accompany this kind of charity. Instead, she looked directly into my eyes. Her gaze was completely clear-piercing and profoundly lucid. There was no shame in her eyes at all. There was only a sharp, calculating intelligence taking my full measure. "You helped exactly the right way," she said. The words hung in the heavy air between us. It was such a bizarre, unforgettable sentence. She did not say thank you. She did not bless me or call me an angel. She evaluated my action. It sounded less like an expression of gratitude and more like an assessment from someone who was used to grading the behavior of the people around her. It was a statement of pure approval regarding my specific method of intervention. Silent, fast, and without demanding any emotional return. I gave her a brief, tight nod, pulled my card from the machine, and turned my attention to my own dog food and milk. By the time I paid for my own groceries and grabbed my heavy plastic bags, she was already gone, vanished into the cool Oklahoma night. I walked out to my car, the wheels of my cart rattling over the uneven pavement of the parking lot. I loaded my trunk, slammed it shut, and got into the driver's seat. Gripping the steering wheel, I let out a long breath, watching the neon blue Walmart sign glowing brightly against the dark sky. I started the engine and drove home, genuinely believing that what had just happened was nothing more than a tiny, isolated moment of kindness on a remarkably bad day. It was just $52. It was just a stranger. I had absolutely no idea that I had just fired the opening shot of a massive, brutal war. I could never have imagined that my simple, impulsive action was the catalyst that would drag me into a terrifying battle of wealth, deceit, and survival, pulling me deeper and more dangerously into the dark than any relationship I had ever known. I had been dating Lucas Holloway for almost exactly 11 months when the invitation finally came. Lucas was a corporate attorney, and he possessed a specific kind of quiet, unshowy elegance that only generational wealth could buy. He never flaunted designer labels or drove flashy, overly aggressive sports cars. Instead, his suits fell perfectly against his shoulders, tailored to a flawless fit, and his watch never caught the light too sharply. He was calm, deliberate, and possessed an infuriatingly smooth temperament that made him an excellent lawyer and an incredibly stabilizing presence in my chaotic life. We met at a silent auction fundraiser for a local Tulsa animal rescue shelter. I was volunteering at the registration desk, handing out bitter paddles and attempting to keep a chaotic spreadsheet organized amidst barking dogs and disorganized donors. Lucas had walked up to my table wearing a perfectly pressed charcoal blazer over a crisp white shirt, looking completely out of place among the rescue volunteers in their faded denim and muddy sneakers. Most women in the room were practically vibrating with eagerness to catch his eye, hoping to secure a massive donation or a dinner date. But I was physically exhausted and simply annoyed that he had forgotten to fill out his registration card completely. I handed him a cheap blue plastic pen and told him bluntly that his handsome smile would not help me input his missing zip code into the database. He laughed a genuine, startled sound that broke through his polished exterior. He told me later that my complete lack of sycophancy and my sharp, direct attitude were exactly what drew him to me. He was exhausted by people who constantly tried to appease him or impress him with false charm. I just wanted him to follow the rules, and that blunt honesty fascinated him. Despite his easy charm and our genuine connection, the gap between our worlds was a silent, invisible river running constantly between us. I grew up in Claremore, a small town where money was a tangible physical struggle, not an abstract concept managed by unseen financial advisors. My father was a journeyman electrician who came home every evening with heavy dark grease deeply embedded in the lines of his palms, his shoulders bowed with sheer physical exhaustion. My mother worked the front desk at the local public middle school managing attendance records and spending her evenings balancing our household budget to the exact penny. Because of my deep working-class roots, I possessed a highly sensitive internal radar for the subtle ways wealthy people measured those who had less. I knew the look intimately. It was the quick, sweeping glance that evaluated the cut of your dress, the brand of your shoes, the neighborhood you lived in, and the pedigree of your last name. I absolutely hated that look. I had spent my entire adult life building a rigorous, demanding career, where I was the one analyzing other people, ensuring no one could ever look down on me or dismiss me as uneducated. Lucas knew about my deep-seated anxieties regarding wealth and class. He always tried his best to soften the sharp edges of his background, assuring me that his family was merely complicated rather than elitist. He frequently used the phrase difficult but not bad whenever his relatives came up in our evening conversations over dinner. However, he always spoke of his grandmother with a distinct mixture of deep reverence and subtle caution. Her name was the undisputed center of gravity in the entire Holloway universe. She was the widow of the brilliant, ambitious man who had built Holloway Cold Storage from a single freezing warehouse into a massive, dominant regional logistics empire. According to Lucas, she still held the ultimate veto power over every major decision the family made, from business acquisitions to philanthropic endowments. So when Lucas finally asked me to accompany him to a formal Sunday lunch at the family estate out by the lake, I felt a sudden sharp spike of dread settle deep in my stomach. He smiled his easy, reassuring smile, reaching across the table to take my hand, and told me it was finally time for me to meet the woman who decided everything in the house. I agreed to go because I loved him and because I stubbornly refused to let my own insecurities dictate my actions. But the tension coiled tightly in my neck for the rest of the week, refusing to let go. I constantly reminded myself that I just needed to be authentic. I was a successful, independent woman with a career I built from the ground up through sheer grit and intelligence. I had nothing to prove to a table full of heirs. Yet my professional instincts, honed by years of investigating corporate fraud and reading the hidden motives of desperate, greedy people, screamed a different warning. Wealthy families never hosted a simple meal. Every gathering was a carefully constructed stage. Every casual conversation was a hidden negotiation, and every newcomer was a variable to be rigorously tested and categorized. On the morning of the lunch, I woke up incredibly early, the pale blue dawn light barely creeping through the blinds of my bedroom window. I needed a physical anchor, something tangible and real to ground me before I stepped into a world of antique silver and polished mahogany. I went into my small, practical kitchen, pulled out my heavy ceramic mixing bowls, and began to bake. I chose my aunt's recipe for a classic Southern pecan pie. It was a labor-intensive process, but the repetitive, familiar motions soothed my racing mind. I rolled out the chilled butter crust, feeling the perfect crumbly texture beneath my fingertips, a skill I had learned standing on a step stool in my childhood kitchen. I whisked the thick, dark corn syrup with fresh eggs, brown sugar, and a heavy dash of real vanilla extract. The rich, sweet aroma filled my apartment, drowning out the sterile, metallic scent of my lingering anxiety. Pouring the sweet filling over the carefully arranged halves of toasted pecans, I felt a sudden surge of quiet defiance. Bringing a homemade pie was a polite, neighborly gesture standard for the world I came from. It was my way of bringing a piece of my own authentic heritage into their imposing fortress. It was a protective shield baked in a simple glass pie dish. Lucas arrived right on time, driving his immaculate black luxury sedan. He wore a navy blue cashmere sweater over a crisp collared shirt, looking effortlessly perfect. He kissed my cheek, took the warm pie from my hands with a look of genuine appreciation, and told me I looked beautiful. I was wearing a simple tailored emerald green dress that I had spent entirely too much time selecting. It was respectable, elegant, but not trying too hard to mimic high fashion. I wanted to look like myself, not a cheap imitation of them. The drive out of the city and toward the affluent lakefront properties took nearly 45 minutes. The landscape gradually shifted from clustered suburban developments to winding tree-lined roads, flanked by heavy stone walls and wrought iron gates. The trees were dense, casting long, cool shadows across the smooth, black asphalt. The houses grew larger and further apart, hidden behind layers of aggressive landscaping and private security signs. The atmosphere in the car was comfortable, but the silence between us felt slightly heavy, charged with an unspoken anticipation. Lucas kept his eyes firmly fixed on the winding road, his grip on the leather steering wheel just a fraction tighter than usual. I watched the sprawling properties pass by, my stomach performing a slow, nervous flip with every mile we covered. Out of nowhere, Lucas broke the silence. His voice was casual, almost too carefully casual, as he reached over to adjust the climate control dial on the dashboard. "Just a heads up," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to the rearview mirror before returning to the road. "Things might be slightly tense around the table today. The family has been caught up in a massive debate all week, and tempers are running a bit high. We are looking at a potential buyout offer from a large private equity firm. They want to acquire the entire cold storage company and absorb it into a national supply chain network." I turned my head to look at his profile, my fraud analyst instincts immediately waking up, pushing the nervous girlfriend aside. "A buyout," I repeated, keeping my tone carefully neutral. "Are we talking about a large transaction?" Lucas nodded, offering a tight, constrained smile that did not reach his eyes. "Tens of millions of dollars. A life-changing amount of liquidity for everyone involved. It would fundamentally change the structure of our family wealth. But my grandmother is dragging her feet on signing the preliminary agreements, and my father is losing his patience rapidly. Everyone has an opinion, and everyone wants their slice of the pie secured before the ink dries. So just ignore them if they start throwing sharp elbows during the salad course. They get competitive when money is on the table." He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was hollow. It lacked his usual warmth and easy confidence. I leaned back against the plush leather passenger seat, staring out at the towering oak trees blurring past my window. He presented the information as a minor domestic squabble, a simple disagreement over business strategy among relatives, but a cold chill ran down my spine, settling heavily at the base of my neck. Tens of millions of dollars. That was not a simple disagreement. That was a profound, undeniable motive. That was the kind of money that made blood relatives turn into ruthless adversaries, willing to cross any moral line to secure their future. I looked down at the white bakery box resting on my lap containing my simple homemade pecan pie. It suddenly felt incredibly naive and small. I was driving into a secluded, heavily guarded compound where the inhabitants were currently locked in a high-stakes battle over an absolute fortune. I realized with a sinking, heavy feeling that I was not just walking into a family home to meet the parents over a casual Sunday roast. I was stepping onto a heavily mined battlefield where money was not just an asset to be managed by accountants. It was a sharp, heavy weapon swung with lethal intent, and everyone at the table was already fully armed and waiting for a target. The tension in the car thickened, wrapping around us like a heavy woolen blanket, suffocating the remaining oxygen in the cabin. I took a deep, slow breath, preparing myself to face the formidable Holloway family, having absolutely no clue that the most dangerous person in that magnificent house was someone I had already encountered under the bleak fluorescent lights of a discount superstore. The tires of Lucas's luxury sedan transitioned from smooth asphalt to meticulously raked gravel, the crisp crunching sound announcing our arrival before we even caught sight of the main house. We passed slowly through a pair of towering wrought iron gates that stood wide open like the dark, heavy jaws of a very expensive trap. The estate unfolded before us, sitting heavily on a sweeping landscaped bluff overlooking the dark, glassy water of the lake. The sheer imposing scale of the place struck me with a sudden physical force. This was not merely a large family home. It was a sprawling fortress built of pale, rough-hewn stone and slate. An impossibly long, winding driveway curved elegantly through lawns so flawlessly manicured they looked entirely synthetic. Tall, antique copper gas lanterns stood like silent, rigid sentinels along the paved path, their flames burning a pale, flickering orange even in the bright midday light. There were no stray autumn leaves on the ground, no overgrown branches, no messy signs of chaotic natural life. Everything was beautiful. But it was a cold, heavily engineered kind of beauty. It was an environment that demanded absolute compliance and silent respect from anyone who dared to step foot on the property. Lucas parked the car near a massive stone fountain and walked around to open my door. I stepped out onto the pristine driveway, clutching my simple white bakery box tightly against my chest like a shield. The silence here was thick and almost pressurized. There were no comforting sounds of distant highway traffic, no neighborhood dogs barking, no children playing in nearby yards. There was just the sharp chill of the wind coming off the lake and the absolute heavy quiet of extreme isolation. He placed a reassuring hand on my lower back and pushed open the massive solid oak double doors, ushering me into the grand foyer. The ceiling soared at least 3 stories high, capped with a massive glass skylight that cast a cool, diffused glow over the entryway. The air smelled intensely of expensive lemon oil, melted beeswax, and ancient polished mahogany. The floors were covered in thick, dark Persian rugs that absorbed sound perfectly. As we walked toward the interior of the house, our footsteps seemed to shrink in volume, the vast, imposing architecture swallowing the noise and making me feel incredibly small and entirely out of place. "Grandma," Lucas called out, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "We are here," a voice answered immediately from the adjacent formal living room. It was a calm, precise tone that carried effortlessly through the heavy air without raising its volume a single decibel. "So it is you." I turned my body toward the wide, arched doorway, stepping onto the threshold of a room filled with pale silk furniture, heavy velvet drapes, and imposing oil portraits in gilded frames. And in that exact second, all the blood drained rapidly from my face, rushing straight to my feet. I froze completely, my breath catching painfully in my throat. Standing by a large bay window, casually adjusting a delicate porcelain teacup on a heavy engraved silver tray, was the woman from the checkout lane. She wore a tailored charcoal wool dress today, perfectly fitted and severe, but it was undeniably her. She had the exact same elegant posture, the same silver hair pulled back into a flawless, rigid bun, the same penetrating, unblinking gaze. She placed the delicate teacup down with a soft, deliberate clink against the silver, acting entirely as though our paths had never crossed under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of a cheap discount store. Lucas stepped up beside me, completely oblivious to the sudden violent drop in my internal temperature and the absolute panic gripping my chest. He smiled warmly and gestured toward the room. "Eva, I would like you to finally meet my grandmother, Ruth Holloway." I tried to speak, but my vocal cords felt utterly paralyzed. Ruth did not extend her hand in greeting. She simply stood there, her hands resting lightly on the ornate edge of the silver tray, and looked directly into my eyes. Her facial expression remained perfectly serene, giving absolutely nothing away to her grandson, but her eyes held a sharp, unmistakable glint of cold recognition. She knew exactly who I was from the very first syllable she spoke. There was no shock in her demeanor, only a quiet, terrifying confirmation that the pieces were now in place on the board. "It is a pleasure to welcome you to our home." "Eva," Ruth said smoothly, her tone perfectly polite, polished, and utterly impenetrable. I managed to swallow the dry, heavy lump in my throat and forced my lips into a polite, rigid smile, praying my voice would not betray my racing pulse. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Holloway." The transition into the formal dining room felt like walking into a hostile corporate boardroom cleverly masked as a domestic dining space. The incredibly long mahogany table was set with heavy sparkling crystal glasses and polished sterling silver cutlery that gleamed aggressively under an ornate cascading chandelier. One by one, the rest of the family filed into the room, taking their designated seats with practiced, entitled ease. Lucas introduced his father, Preston Holloway. Preston was a tall, imposing man with thinning silver hair, a sharp patrician profile, and a tailored suit that cost more than my annual rent. He moved with the impatient, restless energy of a man who firmly believed his time was vastly more valuable than anyone else's in the room. Sitting directly next to him was his wife, Camille. She was Preston's second wife, a woman whose face and figure were meticulously preserved through obvious expensive perfection and a strict dietary regime. She offered me a brilliant, razor-sharp smile that felt significantly more like a tactical warning than a genuine greeting. Across the heavy wooden table sat Ainsley, Lucas's cousin and the current chief financial officer of the family logistics empire. She wore a severe, impeccably tailored dark suit and observed me with the cold, calculating detachment of an auditor analyzing a highly problematic spreadsheet. Beside her slouched Brett, Lucas's younger brother. Brett possessed the effortless, arrogant posture of someone who had never worked a difficult day in his life, but felt entirely entitled to the massive fruits of everyone else's labor. He looked me up and down slowly, his eyes lingering just long enough to make it abundantly clear he was actively appraising my net worth, my background, and finding me severely lacking in value. As the silent household staff began serving the first course, pouring expensive white wine into the crystal glasses, I felt an intense, suffocating pressure settling firmly over my shoulders. I realized very quickly that I was not sitting there simply as Lucas's new girlfriend undergoing a standard intimidating family vetting process. I was a sudden unknown variable, a dangerous wild card dropped right onto the center of the table at the exact moment this family was actively tearing itself apart. The tension in the room was physically palpable, vibrating in the thick air between the clinking salad forks and the polite forced laughter. They were currently locked in a brutal, silent war over corporate control, waiting anxiously for Ruth to sign a set of secret documents that would authorize the massive company buyout, and my sudden, unexpected arrival had somehow disrupted their carefully calibrated timeline. The dinner conversation flowed rapidly around me, incredibly dense with aggressive corporate jargon. They debated industrial real estate zoning, warehouse logistics, and the urgent pressing need for liquid assets. Preston spoke of the impending private equity buyout with a tense, barely contained enthusiasm, leaning forward over his plate, while Ruth offered only non-committal brief responses that clearly infuriated him to his core. But the truly unnerving, terrifying part of the elaborate meal came during the subtle, seemingly casual side conversations. As I carefully cut my roasted asparagus, I noticed a distinct, deeply unsettling pattern emerging. Ainsley would lean back slowly in her heavy wooden chair, swirl her expensive wine in its glass, and make a thinly veiled sarcastic comment about retail consumer habits or the absolute tragedy of shopping at discount superstores. It is honestly fascinating how the lower middle class handles basic economic inflation, Ainsley remarked at one point, her tone dripping with false academic interest while her eyes locked directly onto my face across the table. They just keep flocking to those massive, depressing retail hubs to save pennies. You know the ones. The giant box stores where the lighting gives you an immediate migraine and the clientele looks entirely miserable and desperate. Every single time a comment exactly like that was made, every time a cruel, subtle joke brushed aggressively against the concept of a retail checkout line or a declined credit card, Ainsley's sharp gaze would dart straight to me, burning with a malicious, knowing intent. Camille would offer a soft, mocking chuckle in response, dabbing her perfectly painted lips with a crisp white linen napkin, her eyes dancing with cruel amusement. They knew. I had absolutely no idea how they found out, and I had no idea why it mattered so much to them, but they knew exactly where I had been on that Friday night and exactly what I had done. The air in the opulent dining room grew incredibly thin, making it difficult to draw a full breath. I took a slow, measured sip of my ice water, keeping my hands perfectly steady by sheer, stubborn force of will. The $52 I had paid was not a quiet secret between two strangers anymore. It was a loaded heavy weapon sitting right in the middle of their beautiful dining table, and I realized with cold mounting dread that I was just waiting to see which one of them was going to pick it up and pull the trigger first. The main course arrived on silent feet, served by staff who moved like ghosts along the perimeter of the grand dining room. Throughout the meal, Ruth played the role of the gracious matriarch with absolute terrifying perfection. She ensured my water glass was never empty, asked polite surface-level questions about my drive from the city, and praised the pecan pie I had brought with just the right amount of warmth. She did not overdo her gratitude. She did not throw me a knowing wink or offer any secret conspiratorial smiles. She never once brought up the $52 or the humiliating incident at the register. But her absolute unwavering composure was exactly what made my skin crawl. It felt entirely unnatural. Her flawless etiquette only amplified my creeping suspicion that I was sitting dead center in the middle of a complex, heavily guarded narrative that no one was bothering to explain to me. Preston, however, lacked his mother's ironclad restraint. He clearly viewed Sunday lunch not as a family gathering, but as an extension of a corporate boardroom. He carved his roast beef with aggressive short strokes, dominating the conversation with talk of the impending buyout. He spoke of the private equity firm as if the transaction was already a fully realized reality, citing market capitalization and projected fourth-quarter margins. "It is the only logical step forward. Mother," Preston insisted, pointing his heavy silver fork down the length of the table toward Ruth. "They are offering a premium that exceeds our own internal valuations by at least 20%. It is a golden parachute for all of us, and holding out any longer only risks chilling the buyers." Ruth took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. She placed the crystal glass down gently. "I simply have not seen enough reason to sign my name to that document, Preston," she replied. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it possessed a dense, undeniable gravity that forced everyone else at the table to fall completely silent. A deal is not inevitable, simply because you want it to be. The vein in Preston's forehead throbbed visibly, but he bit back his retort. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sensing the dangerous shift in the atmosphere, Ainsley smoothly pivoted the spotlight, aiming it directly at me. She leaned her elbows elegantly on the polished mahogany, lacing her manicured fingers together. "Lucas mentioned you work at Harbor Ledger Risk Group." "Eva," Ainsley said, her voice dripping with a sugary, fabricated warmth. "A senior fraud analyst. That sounds incredibly intense. You must spend your entire day digging through people's garbage. Financially speaking, of course." Her tone was exceptionally friendly, but her eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. They were the cold, calculating eyes of a seasoned predator evaluating the exact dimensions of a new threat. "I mostly deal with medical billing anomalies and insurance discrepancies," I replied, keeping my voice level and professional. "I look for patterns that do not belong. Mismatched dates, phantom vendors, funds that shift without proper authorization." Ainsley tilted her head, a patronizing smile playing on her lips. "Fascinating. So you are trained to spot liars. You must be very good at figuring out when someone is trying to manipulate a situation to their advantage." Before I could formulate a careful response to that heavily loaded statement, Camille chimed in from across the table. She delicately wiped the corner of her mouth with a pristine white napkin, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier's light. "It is such a useful skill," Camille mused, her voice airy and light, completely masking the venom underneath, especially in today's world. Though I always say, Kind people often just have the most remarkable luck. Do you not agree? Eva, these little accidental meetings in life, the people we just happen to bump into when they need a favor, sometimes those random encounters turn out to be incredibly convenient. Do they not? Not everyone who steps into a fortunate situation is as innocent as they pretend to be. The implication hit me like a physical blow to the chest. It was not a subtle hint. It was a direct, localized strike. She was openly suggesting that I was a gold digger, an opportunist who had orchestrated some elaborate scheme to ingratiate myself with their wealthy family. My hands gripped the heavy fabric of my napkin under the table, my knuckles turning entirely white. I glanced at Lucas, desperately waiting for him to intervene, to defend my character, or at the very least, to call out his stepmother's blatant disrespect. But Lucas simply reached for his water glass, offering a tight, uncomfortable chuckle. "Let us not interrogate my girlfriend over lunch." "Camille," Lucas said, his tone mild and thoroughly accommodating, "we are here to enjoy the food, not conduct a deposition." He thought he was keeping the peace, but his gentle deflection felt like a profound betrayal. It dawned on me with sickening clarity that Lucas was fundamentally conditioned to survive in this toxic environment. He was deeply accustomed to a world where devastating insults were elegantly wrapped in white linen napkins and delivered with proper gleaming smiles. He chose the path of least resistance, smoothing over the conflict rather than confronting the malicious intent behind it. When the grueling meal finally concluded, the family dispersed into various wings of the massive estate. Before I could follow Lucas into the study, Ruth placed a remarkably firm hand on my forearm. "Walk with me to the conservatory." "Eva," she commanded softly. It was not a request. I followed her down a long, sunlit corridor until we stepped into a sprawling glass greenhouse attached to the rear of the mansion. The air instantly shifted, becoming thick, warm, and intensely humid. The smell of rich, damp earth and blooming orchids provided a jarring contrast to the sterile, polished interior of the main house. I expected her to finally mention the checkout lane. I expected a delayed thank you, or perhaps a stern lecture about keeping family secrets. Instead, Ruth stopped beside a large, vibrant fern, turning to face me completely. "Are you good at telling when a room is lying?" "Eva," she asked. The bizarre question caught me entirely off guard. I stared at her, my mind racing to find the hidden trap in her words. "I suppose my job requires a certain level of skepticism," I answered carefully, "but people lie in different ways." Ruth stepped closer, her sharp eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me want to take a step backward. "In this house, my dear," she whispered, "the most dangerous thing is not blatant screaming greed. That kind of greed is sloppy and easy to defeat. No. The most dangerous thing in this family is greed that knows how to wear a bespoke suit, greed that knows exactly how to smile at you over a glass of vintage wine, greed that knows how to hire the best lawyers in the state to make theft look like a perfectly legal administrative update." She did not explain herself any further. She simply turned back to her orchids, leaving me standing in the stifling humidity with a cold, terrifying knot tightening in my stomach. The drive back to the city was completely shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence. The afternoon sun had dipped behind the trees, casting long, dark shadows across the winding asphalt. Lucas drove with his jaw clenched, clearly sensing the massive shift in my demeanor. I finally broke the silence as we merged onto the main highway. "I do not like the way they looked at me." "Lucas," I spoke staring straight ahead at the road. I felt like a distressed credit report being passed around a table of auditors looking for an excuse to deny a loan. Lucas sighed loudly, his hands tightening on the leather steering wheel. "You are overthinking it. Eva, I told you they were stressed about the buyout. They are just protective. You have to understand, people have tried to take advantage of this family for decades. They are naturally suspicious of outsiders." "They were not just suspicious," I shot back, my voice rising slightly despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "Camille practically accused me of staging a premeditated encounter to infiltrate your family. Ainsley cross-examined me like a hostile witness, and you just sat there and let them do it. I was trying to keep the peace, he argued, his tone defensive and sharp. If I had started a screaming match at the dinner table, it would have only made things worse for you. That is how my family communicates. You have to learn to let those comments roll off your back. But I do not want to learn how to tolerate being insulted, I replied, the crushing weight of the afternoon finally settling firmly on my chest. I do not want to smile politely while someone calls me a predator to my face. Lucas did not answer. He just kept his eyes fixed on the taillights in front of us. For the first time since we met at that animal shelter 11 months ago, a very real, very deep fracture opened up between us. It was a crack not built on a lack of affection, but on a fundamental, terrifying difference in how we viewed survival, dignity, and the devastating cost of ignoring the truth. Exactly 3 days after the suffocating Sunday lunch, my entire carefully constructed professional life exploded. It was Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. I had barely set my coffee mug down on my desk at Harbor Ledger Risk Group when my desk phone rang. It was the head of Human Resources requesting my immediate presence in a windowless conference room on the executive floor. I walked into the room expecting a routine discussion about a difficult medical billing case. Instead, I found the Director of Human Resources and the Chief Compliance Officer sitting behind a heavy glass table, looking at me with expressions of grim professional detachment. Resting perfectly in the center of the table was a thick manila folder. The compliance officer pushed the folder across the smooth glass toward me. He explained in a rigidly neutral voice that an anonymous package had been delivered via courier that morning. Copies had also been sent directly to Preston and to Lucas at his law firm. My hands felt unnaturally cold as I opened the heavy paper cover. What I saw inside made the blood roar in my ears. It was a masterclass in character assassination. Someone had taken the random scattered pieces of my life and meticulously stitched them together into a damning predatory narrative. There were grainy printed photographs taken from the dark edge of the store parking lot, showing my sedan parked just 2 spaces away from a sleek black town car. There were heavily redacted screenshots of my professional networking profiles and my private social media accounts. But the most devastating piece of the puzzle was a completely fabricated timeline printed on heavy watermarked paper. The document falsely claimed that I had used our firm's proprietary risk assessment databases to run extensive financial background checks on the logistics empire and its key board members a full 2 months before I ever volunteered at the animal rescue fundraiser. The narrative they constructed was sickeningly clear. I was not a hardworking fraud analyst who had spontaneously helped a distressed elderly woman. I was a calculating financial predator. The dossier alleged that I had specifically targeted the matriarch of a millionaire dynasty, orchestrating the entire grocery store encounter as a brilliant tactical move to cement my position within the family structure after sinking my hooks into her grandson. I sat frozen in the stiff leather chair, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the lie. The compliance officer cleared his throat, stating that while they had no definitive proof that I had misused company resources, the severity of the allegations required them to open a formal internal review. My access to sensitive financial databases was being temporarily restricted. I was not fired, but I was officially tainted. My professional integrity, the single most valuable asset I had spent my entire adult life building from the ground up, was being dragged through the mud and scrutinized by the very people who had trained me. The betrayal felt physical, like a sharp, heavy stone wedged beneath my ribs. I left the building at noon, my head spinning with a toxic mixture of profound humiliation and boiling rage. When I arrived back at my apartment, Lucas was already waiting in the hallway outside my door. He looked entirely exhausted, his shoulders slumped beneath his tailored suit jacket. He held his own copy of the thick manila folder in his hands. I unlocked the door in complete silence, and he followed me into my small living room. I braced myself for his anger. I expected him to throw the folder on the coffee table and demand the truth, but what he did was actually far worse. He sat down on my cheap fabric sofa, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and looked at me with a devastating expression of hesitant sorrow. He did not outright accuse me of executing a master plan. He did not call me a liar. Instead, he began to ask small probing questions. His voice was incredibly soft, wrapped in the gentle, measured cadence he used when deposing a frightened witness. I just need to understand the timeline. Ava, he whispered, staring down at his polished leather shoes. Is there any possibility that you recognized her name when you met her at the store? I know you look at corporate structures all day. Did you ever run a query on the family business out of simple curiosity? Every single syllable he spoke felt like a physical strike against my chest. He was trying to be fair. He was trying to find a logical explanation, but his very need to ask those questions revealed a terrifying truth. His belief in my fundamental character was not absolute. The seed of doubt planted by that anonymous dossier had successfully taken root in his mind. He was looking at the woman he claimed to love, and he was genuinely weighing the possibility that my affection, my history, and my simple act of kindness were all components of an elaborate financial scheme. I stood in the center of the room, looking down at the man who suddenly felt like a complete stranger. "No, Lucas," I answered, my voice stripping away all emotion until it was nothing but cold, flat steel. "I did not look up your family. I did not stalk an elderly woman to pay her $52 grocery bill as part of a grand conspiracy to steal your inheritance. I paid for her tea and her bread because she looked utterly defeated, and because I know exactly what it feels like to stand at a register and pray the machine does not beep twice." Lucas rubbed his temples, his face pale and drawn. "I want to believe you, Eva. I do. But you have to admit the optics of this are incredibly damning. The photographs, the timing of the database searches. My father is threatening to file a restraining order. I am just trying to navigate this before it destroys everything." The phrase optics of this echoed in the small room, ringing with the hollow metallic sound of a corporate defense strategy. I realized right then the most bitter, agonizing truth about the stark dividing line between our two worlds. In the world of the wealthy, innocence was not a default state of being. It was merely a temporary condition waiting to be disproved by a better lawyer. They did not need irrefutable evidence to destroy me. They only needed a cleverly constructed narrative. With a few pieces of paper and a shadow of a doubt, they had effortlessly transformed a working-class woman into a manipulative gold digger. "You do not want to believe me," I told him quietly, walking over to the front door and pulling it open. "You want to audit me, and I absolutely refuse to stand here and provide receipts for my own soul. You need to leave." Lucas stood up, his eyes widening in sudden panic. "Eva, please do not do this. We can hire an investigator. We can prove the timeline is false. We can fight this together." I shook my head, my vision blurring slightly with unshed tears that I violently refused to let fall. "There is no together. Lucas, not when you had to ask me if I was a thief. Go back to your family. They clearly know how to protect their borders." He walked out into the hallway, looking completely shattered, but he did not fight me. He stepped over the threshold, and I closed the heavy wooden door, sliding the deadbolt into place with a definitive metallic click. For the next 72 hours, I existed in a state of suspended animation. I turned my phone on silent and ignored the dozens of missed calls and unread messages from Lucas. I did not cut contact to punish him, and I certainly did not do it because my feelings for him had suddenly evaporated. I did it out of sheer necessary self-preservation. I simply could not allow myself to remain tethered to a world where my deepest vulnerabilities and my basic human decency were being weighed on a scale like toxic financial assets. I spent those 3 days pacing the worn wooden floors of my apartment, alternating between blinding anger and crushing grief. I drafted a letter of resignation to Harbor Ledger Risk Group in my head 100 times. I considered packing my bags, breaking my lease, and driving back to Claremore to escape the suffocating reach of the logistics empire entirely. They had won. The invisible architects behind the dossier had successfully isolated me, discredited my professional name, and shattered my relationship without ever having to show their faces in the light. By Friday evening, I had finally made my decision. I was going to walk away. I was not going to fight a battle against people who could afford to buy reality and bend it to their will. I sat on my sofa, staring blankly at the dark television screen, mentally preparing to send Lucas one final, definitive message that would end everything between us. Just as I reached for my phone on the coffee table, the screen suddenly lit up, vibrating aggressively against the wood. It was not Lucas. It was not an email from the compliance department. It was a standard text message from a completely blocked, untraceable number. I picked up the device, my brow furrowing in confusion. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the single solitary sentence glowing bright white against the dark screen. If you want to know exactly who is using that grocery store receipt to bury you alive, meet me alone. Beneath the cryptic sentence was an address for a 24-hour diner located on the dusty industrial outskirts of the city, followed by a time, tonight at 11 o'clock. I stared at the glowing letters, my heart suddenly hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs. My initial instinct, the instinct of a rational, exhausted woman, screamed at me to delete the message and lock my doors. It was clearly a trap, but the analytical side of my brain, the part that spent years hunting down discrepancies and exposing hidden truths, flared to life with a brilliant, burning intensity. Someone in that massive stone house had dragged my name through the dirt. They had stolen my career and poisoned the man I loved. I set the phone down, walked into my bedroom, and grabbed my heavy winter coat. I was not going to run away. I drove far beyond the familiar city limits, navigating toward the industrial outskirts where the streetlights grew sparse and the landscape was dominated by dark, hulking warehouses. The diner was a forgotten relic from a previous decade, its neon sign flickering a dull, angry red against the pitch-black Oklahoma sky. I parked my sedan on the cracked, uneven asphalt near a rusted pickup truck and sat behind the steering wheel for a long moment, letting the engine idle. My pulse was hammering a frantic rhythm against my throat. I fully expected to walk inside and find an aggressive corporate lawyer sliding a non-disclosure agreement across a table, or perhaps a private investigator hired by Preston to officially threaten me. I pushed the heavy glass door open, the attached metal bell announcing my arrival with a sharp, grating ring. The air inside smelled deeply of stale coffee, old frying grease, and lemon floor cleaner. At 11 o'clock on a Friday night, the place was entirely deserted except for a tired waitress wiping down the front counter. I scanned the rows of torn vinyl booths. Sitting alone in the furthest corner booth, shrouded in the dim light of a flickering overhead bulb, was Ruth Holloway. She wore a dark, heavy wool trench coat, her posture just as impossibly rigid and elegant as it had been in her pristine lakeside mansion. There was no armored town car idling outside. She had no chauffeur, no security detail, and no intimidating legal assistants hovering nearby to manage her affairs. Resting squarely on the chipped formica table in front of her was a massive stack of thick manila folders, bound tightly together with a frayed piece of heavy brown string. I walked over and slid into the booth opposite her. The cracked vinyl groaned under my weight. She did not offer a polite smile or a grandmotherly greeting. She did not waste a single second on pleasantries. She simply pushed a steaming, heavy ceramic mug of black coffee across the table toward me. "The grocery store was not a staged event," Ruth said quietly, her voice cutting straight through the heavy silence of the diner. "But it was not a harmless coincidence either." I frowned, wrapping my cold hands around the warm mug, waiting for the rest of the explanation. Ruth kept her voice remarkably low, blending perfectly with the low mechanical hum of the diner's old refrigerator unit. "My credit card was declined that evening because the primary financial account linked to it had been temporarily frozen. I did not authorize that freeze. It was an internal security hold, placed directly by the family trust's own accounting office." She leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes catching the harsh light. "Someone in my own house is slowly and methodically tightening a noose around my financial autonomy. They are intentionally manufacturing these little administrative errors. A frozen card at a public register here, a delayed wire transfer there. They are carefully building a highly documented narrative that I'm getting far too old, that my memory is rapidly failing, and that I am no longer mentally competent to hold the primary signatory rights for the logistics empire." I stared at her, the chaotic pieces of the last few days slowly beginning to align into a terrifying, cohesive picture. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice tight with lingering anger. Your family just spent 3 days trying to entirely destroy my professional life. They turned me into a predator. Ruth nodded slowly, a look of grim acknowledgement passing over her features. They tried to destroy you because you are a sudden variable they cannot control. I noticed you at that checkout lane, not because you paid the bill, but because of exactly how you executed the help. You did not demand a grand performance of gratitude. You saw a humiliating problem. You fixed it with absolute efficiency, and you walked away in silence. That specific kind of quiet, unselfish competence is entirely extinct in my house. I am surrounded by people who only move when there is a camera, an audience, or a massive paycheck involved. She reached out with her perfectly manicured hands, untied the rough brown string, and pushed the thick stack of papers across the table until it touched my coffee mug. These are internal company records, Ruth explained. Invoices for warehouse roof repairs, board meeting minutes, ledgers from our charitable foundation, and several highly specific internal wire transfer requests. My intuition is screaming that there is a massive systemic fraud happening right under my roof, but my children and my grandchildren are incredibly smart. They cover their tracks with dense layers of legitimate corporate bureaucracy. Everything looks entirely legal on the surface. They are far too well dressed and legally insulated to be caught by a standard audit. I look down at the pale manila folders, feeling a sudden wave of sheer exhaustion wash over me. I push the heavy stack back toward her, shaking my head firmly. I cannot do this, Mrs. Holloway. I have already lost my security clearance at work. My professional reputation is currently bleeding out on a human resources desk. I am not getting dragged any deeper into your family's civil war. I am done. Just give it 10 minutes, Ruth challenged, her voice completely devoid of pity or pleading. You are an investigator, Eva. Look at the paper. If you tell me there is absolutely nothing there, I will take the folders back. I will walk out of this diner, and you will never see me again. I let out a long, ragged breath, closing my eyes for a brief second. Against every single instinct of self-preservation I possessed, I reached out and flipped open the heavy cover of the top folder. The cheap diner faded away into the background. I was no longer a disgraced girlfriend hiding in my apartment. I was a senior fraud analyst back in my absolute element. I pulled a pen from my purse and began flipping through the first batch of vendor invoices, my eyes rapidly scanning columns of numbers, dates, and authorization codes. Within exactly 8 minutes, the pattern jumped off the page, practically glowing in the dim light. The sheer arrogance of the execution was staggering. I pulled 3 separate invoices from the pile and laid them side by side on the chipped table. Look at this, I whispered, my finger tapping sharply against the billing addresses. They are using the exact same regional vendor for industrial refrigeration maintenance across 3 different state facilities, but the vendor is operating under 3 different corporate names. The tax identification numbers listed at the bottom are strictly sequential, which means these shell companies were registered on the exact same day by the exact same entity. I flipped rapidly to a stack of internal meeting minutes, and look right here, the scanned signature authorizing these absurdly inflated repair costs. The ink density and the stroke pressure are mathematically identical on every single page. No human being signs their name with the exact same pressure 10 times in a row. It is a high-resolution digital stamp, placed slightly off-center by a few millimeters each time to create the illusion of an authentic physical signature. Ruth leaned back against the vinyl booth, a dark, terrifying satisfaction settling over her aristocratic features. You found the structural cracks faster than my own incredibly expensive accountants did. She then delivered the final crushing piece of the puzzle. If they can successfully force me to step down and push through the private equity buyout without my interference, Preston, Camille, and Ainsley have secretly structured the back end of the deal to include massive retention bonuses for themselves. We are talking about tens of millions of dollars routed directly into their private offshore accounts the moment the ink dries. And I will be politely pushed into a dark corner, given a meaningless honorary title, and stripped of all actual authority over the company my husband built. I sat back in my seat, the sheer devastating scale of the betrayal finally washing over me completely. This entire nightmare was never actually about me. I was just convenient collateral damage. I was a highly useful scapegoat they manufactured to discredit Ruth's judgment, distract Lucas, and protect their massive impending payday. I looked down at the forged signatures and the fake corporate entities scattered across the table. The deep sorrow and the blinding anger that had been paralyzing me for 3 days suddenly crystallized into something entirely different. It hardened into a cold, sharp weapon. If I walked out of this diner and drove back to my apartment to hide, Preston and Ainsley would win. They would take their millions. They would steal this brilliant woman's legacy, and they would leave my entire career permanently buried under their fabricated lies. I would be a footnote in their victory lap. But if I stayed, if I took these files and weaponized my professional skills, I could tear their entire pristine, impenetrable world apart piece by piece. I realized in that exact moment that this was no longer a matter of defending my bruised pride or saving a romantic relationship. This was about fundamental justice, and I was exactly the right person to deliver it. I did not close the folders. I pulled the entire heavy stack closer to my side of the table, aligning the edges perfectly, ready to begin the real work. The very next morning, my dining room table was entirely transformed into a makeshift war room. Ruth had quietly assembled a microscopic but highly lethal strike team. She brought in Miriam Sloan, her personal attorney of over 30 years, a woman whose grandmotherly floral blouses completely masked a terrifyingly sharp legal mind. Completing our quartet was Darius Pike, the former financial controller for the logistics empire. Darius was a nervous chain-drinking coffee addict who had abruptly resigned 6 months prior when Preston pressured him to sign off on a series of highly questionable quarterly forecasts. We spent the next 48 hours submerged in a sea of bank statements, printed emails, and encrypted hard drives Darius had smuggled out before his departure. I sat at the head of the table, letting my professional instincts take the wheel completely. We began hunting down the shell companies I had briefly spotted during my initial review. The most prominent bleeder of capital was an entity registered as Red Clay Facilities. On paper, they were an elite contractor billing exorbitant monthly fees for specialized coolant system maintenance across 7 regional warehouses. However, when I cross-referenced the corporate registration data with public property records, the veil dissolved instantly. The primary beneficiary of Red Clay Facilities was a holding company owned entirely by Camille's younger brother. They were bleeding the corporate accounts dry and funneling the stolen cash straight into the family by marriage. But Ainsley was the true architect of the evasion. As the chief financial officer, she knew exactly where the internal tripwires were buried. Any expense exceeding $50,000 required a mandatory secondary review by an independent auditor. I highlighted a massive column of transactions on my spreadsheet, turning my laptop screen so Darius and Miriam could see the numbers clearly. "Look at the payment structuring," I explained, tracing my finger down the glowing screen. Ainsley is breaking down the massive maintenance invoices into dozens of smaller payments. $49,900 here. $48,500 there. She is intentionally keeping every single transfer just below the mandatory reporting threshold to bypass the automated security system. Miriam adjusted her reading glasses, her jaw setting into a hard, rigid line, and she is legitimizing these payouts by attaching them to the annual budget amendment minutes. Minutes that Ruth allegedly signed, but we already know those signatures are digital forgeries planted after the fact. While they built the legal framework for the financial theft, I turned my attention to the weapon they had used against me personally. I pulled the anonymous dossier out of my bag, spreading the grainy photographs and printed social media timelines across the wood. Using basic reverse image search tools and extracting the embedded metadata from the printed timestamps, I dismantled their entire narrative in under 2 hours. The timeline claiming I stalked Ruth for 2 months was entirely reverse-engineered. They had purchased commercial data broker lists showing my generic geographical movements and spliced them together with photographs taken well after the grocery store incident. The picture of my car parked near the town car was not taken before I met Lucas. The metadata proved it was snapped 2 days after the disastrous Sunday lunch, right in the driveway of the estate, aggressively cropped to look like a public parking lot. They built the crime to fit the exact punishment they wanted to deliver. Darius picked up the grocery store receipt I had printed out. He stared at the date, his eyes widening behind his thick glasses. "The second week of October," Darius murmured, his voice trembling slightly. "Eva, that was the exact same week Ainsley ordered the accounting department to execute a total system migration for all executive credit accounts. She claimed it was a routine security upgrade, but she used the migration to quietly alter the administrative access rights on Ruth's personal accounts." The final piece clicked into place with a sickening thud. The declined card was never a random banking error. It was a deliberate orchestrated test run. They froze her funds while she was out in public to see if she would panic, to document her looking confused and helpless, feeding directly into their narrative that she was mentally slipping and needed a conservatorship. We were packing up the files late on a Wednesday evening when a heavy knock rattled my front door. I checked the peephole and felt my stomach drop instantly. It was Lucas. I stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, closing my apartment door firmly behind me so he could not see the mountain of evidence covering my dining table. He looked completely wrecked, his usual polished demeanor replaced by dark circles under his eyes and a wrinkled collar. "Ava, please, you have to stop this," Lucas pleaded, his voice echoing loudly in the narrow corridor. "My father knows you have been talking to Darius. They are drafting a massive corporate espionage lawsuit against you right now. You are playing a very dangerous game." I crossed my arms over my chest, my posture perfectly rigid. "I am not playing a game. Lucas, I am finishing the one your family started." He reached out, his hand hovering in the air before dropping back to his side in defeat. "You are letting my grandmother use you as a pawn in her war against my father. She is manipulating your anger to serve her own agenda. You need to walk away before you end up in a jail cell." I looked at the man I had loved for nearly a year, feeling nothing but a profound freezing clarity. The person utilizing others as disposable tools right now is certainly not Ruth, I replied coldly. "Your father and your cousin manufactured a fraudulent background check to destroy my career, just to distract you from their own massive thievery. And you let them do it." Lucas flinched, stepping back as if I had struck him physically, but then he delivered the final fatal blow to whatever was left of our relationship. "I did not let them do anything. Ava, I was just trying to be objective." I read through that anonymous file 5 or 6 times, just to make absolutely sure I did not miss anything. I had to know for certain that you were not actually involved. The silence that followed his confession was deafening. He had read the lies multiple times. He had sat in his expensive law office, reviewing forged documents, actively searching for a reason to believe that the woman he slept next to was a calculating predator. He did not defend me in the dark. He investigated me. He applied his ruthless corporate logic to our romance, weighing the probability of my guilt against his family's pristine reputation. I stepped back, putting a solid foot of physical distance between us. "You looked for my guilt, Lucas, because deep down, the absolute arrogance of your bloodline made you believe that a working-class girl could never just love you without an ulterior motive. We are entirely done. Do not ever come to my door again." I turned the knob and walked back inside, locking the deadbolt with a loud, decisive snap, leaving him standing completely alone in the hallway. Leaning against the heavy wood of the door, I did not cry. The hurt was certainly there, a deep hollow ache expanding in my chest, but it was completely eclipsed by an icy, overwhelming focus. They had systematically stripped away my professional reputation, my romantic relationship, and my basic peace of mind. They had painted me as a greedy, manipulative villain simply because I possessed less money than they did, assuming I would just bow my head and disappear into the shadows. I walked back to the dining table, looking at the forged invoices, the shattered metadata, and the undeniable proof of their greed. If they truly wanted me to be the villain in their grand family drama, I was no longer going to disappoint them. I was going to be the exact villain they feared the most. The one who knew every single one of their dark secrets, the one who held all the receipts, and the one who was fully prepared to burn their beautiful, deceitful stage straight to the ground. The counterattack from the estate did not take long to arrive, and when it finally did, It was completely suffocating. By Thursday morning, less than 24 hours after I locked Lucas out of my apartment, my phone rang with a chillingly formal tone. It was the Director of Human Resources at Harbor Ledger Risk Group. His voice was entirely devoid of the professional warmth we had shared over the past 5 years. He informed me that the executive committee had decided to place me on an indefinite paid administrative leave while they expanded their internal review of my conduct. Being put on paid leave might sound like a brief vacation to someone outside the corporate compliance world, but in my industry, it is the absolute kiss of death. It meant my reputation was currently suspended by a single frayed thread over a massive fire. My building access badges were immediately deactivated. My company laptop was remotely wiped of all data. I was entirely locked out of my own professional life. The opposition only needed to apply one more ounce of pressure to push me completely off the ledge and kill my career forever. That very afternoon, a heavy, aggressive knock rattled my apartment door. It was not Lucas returning to apologize. It was a private process server handing me a thick envelope sealed with the crest of a terrifyingly expensive downtown law firm. I tore the heavy paper open and found a formal cease and desist order orchestrated entirely by Camille. The legal document was an absolute masterpiece of elite gaslighting. It formally demanded that I immediately halt my alleged campaign of targeted harassment against the Holloway family. The letter spun a wild, fictional narrative claiming I was an unstable, disgruntled woman who was obsessively stalking their elderly matriarch for financial gain. They were intentionally constructing a legally binding framework to paint me as an unhinged predator, completely ignoring the massive, undeniable fact that they were the ones who had launched the initial smear campaign against me. They were using the justice system as a blunt, heavy instrument to bludgeon me into permanent silence. While Camille attacked me relentlessly from the outside, Ainsley was ruthlessly tightening the vice around Ruth on the inside. Miriam called an emergency meeting at my dining table on Friday evening, her face pale and drawn tight with exhaustion. She told us that Ainsley had spent the entire week making highly strategic phone calls to the most influential members of the corporate board. Ainsley was expertly planting seeds of doubt, whispering tragic fabricated stories about Ruth suffering from severe cognitive decline. She claimed Ruth was becoming painfully senile and was being actively manipulated by a younger outsider who was preying on her misplaced generosity. Ainsley was laying the solid groundwork for an emergency internal board vote to permanently strip Ruth of all her signatory rights over the massive family assets. The situation escalated to a terrifying peak the following morning. Preston attempted to force Ruth into a hastily arranged financial competency evaluation. He had hired a private medical evaluator who was notoriously sympathetic to corporate heirs looking to expedite their inheritances. They ambushed Ruth in her own formal sitting room, demanding she submit to a rigorous cognitive assessment on the spot. Miriam had to physically rush to the estate and threaten Preston with a massive public elder abuse lawsuit just to drag the medical examiner out of the house. We all knew the terrifying reality looming over us. If Preston managed to secure just one single adverse medical report, he could instantly petition a judge for full legal control of the family trust, rendering Ruth entirely powerless over the empire she helped build. The immense pressure was agonizing, but it forced me into a state of hyper-focused clarity. I absolutely refused to be a passive victim waiting in the dark for the final blow. I sat at my dining table surrounded by boxes of financial documents, my eyes burning fiercely from a total lack of sleep. Miriam and I were dissecting a copy of an internal family trust memo. This specific memo detailed Ruth allegedly exhibiting severe confusion during a private family meeting, which Preston fully intended to use as concrete evidence of her declining mental capacity. The document was formally notarized by a state official to prove its unyielding authenticity. I stared closely at the raised seal and the small ink date stamped right beside it. I blinked hard, rubbed my tired eyes, and looked again. The date of the alleged meeting where Ruth supposedly failed to remember basic financial details was the 15th of November. But the official notary stamp authenticating the memo was clearly dated the 12th of November. I slid the piece of paper across the smooth wood to Miriam. my heart pounding a fierce, rapid rhythm against my ribs. "Look at the timeline," I said, pointing directly at the blue ink. Preston and Ainsley drafted and notarized a legal document detailing Ruth collapsing mentally 3 entire days before the meeting where the collapse supposedly happened. It is a premeditated script. They did not document a medical tragedy, they pre-planned a corporate coup, before Miriam could even fully process the magnitude of the forged timeline. Darius burst into my apartment carrying a battered leather briefcase. He dropped a thick stack of stapled papers right in the center of the table. It was a complete, unredacted copy of the preliminary buyout offer from the private equity firm, a document he had somehow managed to secure through a lingering contact in the due diligence department. Darius flipped rapidly past the standard valuation metrics and slammed his finger down on a highly classified appendix hidden at the very back of the massive proposal. It was a secret compensation structure. The clause explicitly promised a staggering $8 million performance bonus to Preston and a $5 million retention bonus to Ainsley, but only under one incredibly specific condition. The buyout transaction had to close and become legally binding before the end of the current fiscal quarter, completely bypassing any potential delays caused by Ruth changing her mind. The sheer velocity of their greed was entirely breathtaking. They were not just stealing money from the logistics empire. They were actively selling the entire company out from under the woman who owned it, racing desperately against a strict corporate deadline to secure their own massive payouts before anyone could uncover the rotting, fraudulent foundation of their deal. I stood up, walking over to the living room window and looking down at the dark, quiet city streets below. We possessed all the lethal ammunition we needed. We had the forged invoices, the rigged notary dates, the fake timelines, and the secret buyout bonuses. But holding the truth in a cramped apartment was entirely useless against a family that could afford to keep a private army of corporate lawyers on a permanent retainer. If we took these documents to a standard courtroom, Preston would simply bury us in years of expensive procedural delays. He would use his massive wealth to exhaust my limited resources, dragging the fight deep into the dark, legal shadows where he held all the structural power. I knew with absolute certainty that I could never win a quiet private war of attrition against billionaires. I needed a massive public arena. I needed a room packed with people, specifically the exact people who currently believed they held the ultimate upper hand. Later that same evening, the absolute perfect stage presented itself. An intricate silver-embossed invitation arrived at Ruth's residence, a digital copy of which she immediately forwarded to my phone. It was the official announcement for the highly anticipated annual Autumn Gala hosted by the Holloway Foundation. The lavish event was the absolute crown jewel of the city's elite social calendar, a night where the family polished their pristine public image in front of hundreds of wealthy investors, local politicians, and media representatives. Accompanying the beautiful invitation was a sleek press release stating that Preston Holloway would be making a monumental announcement regarding the future leadership and strategic direction of the logistics empire during his keynote speech. They were going to use the gala as their ultimate public victory lap. Preston planned to stand confidently under the glowing crystal chandeliers, holding a glass of expensive vintage champagne, and publicly announce his mother's tragic retirement, effectively crowning himself the undisputed king of the company. I realized in that exact moment that the gala was the night they fully intended to bury my reputation forever, using their grand triumph to completely erase my existence and validate their lies. But as I looked at the digital invitation glowing brightly on my phone screen, a cold, ruthless smile slowly spread across my face. They wanted a grand public spectacle to finalize their theft and celebrate their brilliance. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. That night was not going to be my quiet burial. It was going to be the night I dug their graves in front of the entire city. For the next 14 days, I practically vanished from the face of the earth. I stopped leaving my apartment during daylight hours. I did not answer any phone calls from unknown numbers, and I completely ignored the threatening legal letters that were routinely shoved under my door. To Preston and his high-priced corporate lawyers, my absolute silence was the ultimate confirmation of their total victory. They firmly believed that their brutal smear campaign had successfully broken my spirit, forcing the disgraced fraud analyst to retreat permanently into the shadows. To Lucas, my disappearance signaled something entirely different but equally final. He assumed I had chosen to walk away from his chaotic, toxic world forever, cutting my losses to protect whatever was left of my shattered pride. They were all completely wrong. I was not hiding in defeat. I was actively building a bomb. Inside my apartment, the air was thick with the smell of fresh printer ink, warm electronics, and cold stale coffee. Miriam and I worked in absolute synchronized silence, systematically packaging every single piece of explosive evidence we had managed to gather. We did not just compile a loose collection of angry accusations. We built an airtight, bulletproof legal and financial narrative that no team of expensive attorneys could ever dismantle. We organized the digital access logs, proving exactly when Ainsley altered the security protocols on the family banking accounts. We traced the exact route of the stolen corporate funds, mapping the complicated money trail from the legitimate warehouse maintenance budgets directly into the offshore shell companies controlled by the brother of Camille. We placed the forged notary scans, the ones bearing the impossible dates, into clear plastic protective sleeves. Finally, we printed the original source metadata that definitively proved my anonymous dossier was a malicious, fabricated lie. Every single document was cross-referenced, perfectly indexed, and bound in heavy black leather folders. While I managed the relentless forensic accounting from my dining room table, Ruth was delivering the absolute greatest theatrical performance of her entire life back at the lakefront estate. She played the role of the defeated, fading matriarch with terrifying perfection. She stopped arguing with Preston during their morning strategy meetings. She began taking her meals alone in her private bedroom, complaining of sudden deep exhaustion and mild mental confusion. When Ainsley presented her with highly complex budget proposals, Ruth would simply sigh heavily, rub her temples, and vaguely agree without ever asking to read the fine print. Her calculated surrender made Ainsley and Preston dangerously overconfident. They firmly believed their master plan to initiate a graceful, honorable retirement for the matriarch was proceeding flawlessly without a single obstacle left in their path. But the perfectly constructed illusion of their victory began to crack in one highly specific place. Lucas was slowly waking up from his obedient coma. The catalyst for his awakening was Darius. The nervous former financial controller cornered Lucas late one evening in the underground concrete parking garage of his law firm. Darius did not offer a long emotional plea or ask for permission to speak. He simply handed Lucas a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of an old internal board meeting minute, but this specific version featured blatant handwritten edits in the margins, edits that explicitly directed thousands of dollars away from a legitimate charity project and into a highly questionable private consulting firm. The handwriting undeniably belonged to Ainsley. Standing in the cold, dimly lit garage, Lucas finally pieced the devastating puzzle together. He realized with sickening clarity that the anonymous dossier was never actually about protecting the family wealth from a manipulative gold digger. His own father and his cousin had actively weaponized his deepest personal insecurities, using his lingering fear of being used to completely isolate me and push me entirely out of the picture. They knew Lucas would analyze the fake evidence instead of blindly defending the woman he loved, and they played him perfectly. Lucas tried desperately to contact me after that shattering revelation. He left dozens of voicemails, his voice thick with profound regret and desperate apologies. He begged for a single chance to help me fight back, promising to use his considerable legal expertise to tear his father's grand plan apart from the inside. I deleted every single message without replying. I did not let him into my makeshift war room, and I did not share a single detail of my impending counterattack. He had completely missed his window of opportunity. I needed a partner who would stand firmly by my side when the manufactured evidence pointed heavily against me, when defending my honor was difficult and socially costly. He chose to act as my skeptical auditor when I needed a loyal ally, and I absolutely refused to let him swoop in at the final hour to play the redeeming hero in a brutal battle I had already fought and won in the dark. the highly anticipated night of the annual autumn gala finally arrived. The weather outside was unusually crisp and cold for late November. But inside the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive downtown hotel, the atmosphere was thick with warmth, extreme wealth, and overwhelming arrogance. Hundreds of elite guests, corporate partners, influential politicians, and wealthy local sponsors mingled comfortably under massive glowing crystal chandeliers. Waiters dressed in pristine white jackets circulated smoothly with heavy silver trays loaded with expensive vintage champagne and delicate caviar appetizers. It was the ultimate glittering stage for the Holloway family, the exact place where they annually polished their philanthropic image and solidified their untouchable social status in the city. Ainsley was reportedly radiating absolute, unwavering confidence. She floated effortlessly through the crowded ballroom in a stunning emerald silk gown, accepting warm compliments and shaking hands with prominent local dignitaries. She was so incredibly certain of her impending victory that she had already intentionally leaked portions of her prepared speech to a few friendly journalists. She fully intended to take the microphone later that evening and weave a tragic but deeply inspiring tale about the heavy burden of managing immense generational wealth. She planned to explicitly mention the heartbreaking reality of greedy outsiders who preyed upon the compassionate nature of vulnerable elderly family members. It was a thinly veiled final strike specifically designed to completely assassinate my character in front of the entire city elite. As the lavish evening progressed toward its grand climax, the lively classical orchestra music slowly faded into a soft, expectant silence. The guests began to take their designated seats around the beautifully decorated tables. Preston Holloway confidently climbed the short carpeted steps to the elevated main stage. He looked impeccably sharp in his tailored dark tuxedo, his silver hair catching the bright, intense spotlight. He tapped his crystal champagne flute with a solid silver spoon, the sharp ringing sound demanding the immediate undivided attention of the massive room. "Thank you all for joining us on this truly magnificent evening," Preston began, his deep resonant voice echoing clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Tonight is not just a standard celebration of our charitable foundation. Tonight marks a profound historic transition for the entire Holloway family and our global logistics enterprise." He was just taking a deep, dramatic breath, preparing to officially announce Ruth's complete removal from corporate power, when the heavy mahogany double doors at the very back of the grand ballroom swung open with a loud, undeniable thud. Every single head in the room, including the head of Preston Holloway, turned sharply toward the sudden, unexpected disruption. I stepped confidently over the threshold and walked directly into the blinding light of the ballroom. I did not wear a glittering ball gown or expensive borrowed diamonds. I wore a simple, sharply tailored black dress, the kind of dress a woman wears when she means absolute serious business. My posture was perfectly straight, and my heels clicked a steady, rhythmic warning against the polished marble floor. I completely ignored the sudden collective gasp from the wealthy guests seated at the tables nearest the door. I ignored Camille's perfectly contoured face draining of all its color, and I ignored the look of sheer absolute panic that instantly shattered Ainsley's smug, rehearsed expression. Tucked securely under my right arm was a heavy, thick black leather binder. It did not contain wild rumors, anonymous internet accusations, or cleverly worded legal threats. It contained the original banking logs, the forensic data, and the undeniable concrete truth. I had brought the single most dangerous weapon you could possibly introduce to a room entirely filled with wealthy liars. I brought the original receipts, and I was fully prepared to read every single one of them out loud before the night was over. Preston gripped the polished edges of the mahogany podium, his voice booming over the state-of-the-art sound system. He spoke grandly about a smooth and seamless transition of power, a glorious new era for the logistics empire, and the heavy burden of leadership. He raised his crystal champagne flute high into the bright spotlight, a triumphant smile plastered across his face, fully ready to toast to his own coronation. But before the delicate rim of the glass could even touch his lips, Ruth stood up from the center table. She did not ask for a microphone, yet her voice sliced through the massive crowded ballroom like a cold steel blade. She announced with absolute devastating clarity that she had never signed a single document of resignation, nor had she transferred a fraction of an ounce of her legal authority to anyone in that room. The entire ballroom froze instantly. The silence was so profound and heavy you could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. Ruth turned her sharp, unwavering gaze toward the heavy double doors at the back of the room and called me forward. She did not introduce me as a mere guest or a +1. She introduced me as the woman who was going to explain exactly how this esteemed flawless family was nearly robbed blind right beneath their pristine veneer of upper-class civility. I walked straight up the center aisle to the stage, my black leather binder heavy and solid in my hands. I took the microphone from a completely paralyzed Preston. I started with the smallest thread and systematically unraveled their entire grand tapestry of treason. I explained to the breathless crowd that the declined credit card at the discount store was not a banking error, but a deliberate internal access restriction executed by their own accounting department to make Ruth appear mentally incompetent. I moved swiftly to the wildly inflated warehouse repair invoices. I detailed exactly how Red Clay Facilities was nothing more than a hollow shell company directly funneling corporate maintenance funds straight into the private bank accounts of the brother of Camille. Then I dropped the heaviest anchor of all. I revealed the secret classified appendix in the buyout contract, promising multi-million-dollar retention bonuses directly to Preston and Ainsley, but only if they successfully sold the entire company before Ruth could intervene and stop the sale. Ainsley lunged toward the front of the stage, her face twisted in an ugly, unrecognizable mask of sheer panic and pure rage. She screamed into the silent crowd that I was nothing but a manipulative gold digger, a liar who had entirely staged the grocery store encounter to infiltrate their wealth and destroy their good name. I did not flinch. I simply gave a sharp nod to the audio-visual technician in the back booth. The massive projection screens behind the stage instantly lit up. I displayed the original raw metadata for the entire room to see. The ballroom stared at the irrefutable digital proof that the anonymous dossier was frantically manufactured days after I had already met the family. They saw the spliced parking lot photographs and the altered digital timelines laid bare for the desperate amateur forgery it truly was. Then Miriam stepped out from the front row of tables. She held up the certified legal memorandum detailing the supposed cognitive decline of Ruth Holloway. She pointed out the fatal flaw with brutal surgical precision. The state notary stamp authenticating the document was dated 3 full days before the alleged incident of confusion ever actually took place. Miriam announced loudly that what started as a greedy civil corporate maneuver had just officially crossed the rigid legal line into a severe criminal conspiracy. From the center of the stunned crowd, Lucas slowly stood up. He looked completely shattered, a hollow man forced to watch his entire legacy burn to ash under the chandelier lights. He raised his voice over the rising, shocked murmurs of the wealthy guests and publicly confirmed that his family had fed him the forged dossier from the very beginning. He looked me directly in the eyes across the vast room and offered a broken public apology, but his regret could not extinguish the raging fire currently consuming his bloodline. Ruth had not just invited wealthy socialites to this gala. She had secretly convened a special emergency session of the corporate board of directors, seating them strategically throughout the room. Right there, amidst the half-empty champagne flutes and the stunned silence, the board initiated an emergency vote. They immediately and unanimously suspended Preston and Ainsley from all executive duties. The lead attorney representing the private equity firm stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and publicly formally withdrew their massive buyout offer on the spot, refusing to touch the toxic fallout. Preston collapsed heavily into a nearby chair, surrounded by the absolute ruin of his empire in the exact room he had rented to celebrate his ultimate triumph. By the end of that chaotic night, the landscape of their privileged lives was permanently scorched. Camille lost all her legal representation rights within the family trust. Ainsley was staring directly down the barrel of a massive federal financial investigation. Preston was completely abandoned by the exact same elite peers who had been eagerly raising their glasses to him just an hour prior. As for me, my professional name was entirely cleared. Harbor Ledger Risk Group frantically called the very next morning, offering my old position back with a significant promotion and a massive, desperate apology. But I declined their offer. Ruth did not try to thank me by writing a vulgar, flashy check or offering a patronizing reward. Instead, she offered me a completely different kind of partnership. She offered to fully capitalize a brand new independent anti-fraud consulting firm. She suggested the name Plain Truth Advisory. This time, I accepted her money. I did not take it as charity or a belated apology. I took it as a strict business arrangement built entirely on a foundation of absolute mutual respect. A few weeks later, I sat behind the heavy oak desk in my new downtown corner office. I opened a small padded envelope Ruth had sent over by private courier. Inside was the original grocery store receipt. She had actually taken the time to have the thin, fragile slip of paper professionally laminated, like some sort of bizarre, hard-won victory medal. I held the stiff plastic in my hands, looking at the faded printed ink. I finally understood the profound, undeniable truth of the entire brutal ordeal. $52 could never buy a millionaire, but it was exactly enough to unmask an entire dynasty of liars who genuinely believed their wealth gave them the absolute right to rewrite reality. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support it even further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.